I think the timing is undeniable that in the week that student leaders of those protests were being rounded up, you had the government quietly drop the phrasing zero COVID. You had the government starting to talk about how there were no long-term complications that you get from COVID, how Omicron actually has quite a low viral load. At the same time, as early as November, the government in Beijing at least had already started talking about these optimization measures to prevent some of the most ridiculous examples of what I've just described of zero COVID. So I think really since Omicron entered the country, the zero COVID policy was really stepped up when it comes to implementation, to the extent that if you were contact of a positive case, so not even if you personally came into contact with a personal positive case, but someone you came into contact with also came into contact with a positive case, you could be quarantined at one point. Now that is gone, and so other testing requirements, for example, getting into somewhere in public, you need like a negative test within 24 or 48 hours, negative PCR test. But bearing in mind that these are not at-home kits, these are lining up at testing sites in order to get tested. All of that is looking to be going out of the window at the moment. It's worth saying that it's a bit of a patchwork at the moment, because what's little appreciated outside of China is that because it is such a huge country, regional officials actually have a lot of say in the implementation of zero COVID. So what we're seeing is different regions testing slightly different ways of opening up. But basically the main thing that is going at the moment is the requirement to test in order to go into public spaces. And that really opens up a lot of possibilities.
And Cindy, to what extent do you think this is happening in response to some of the protests we've seen in recent weeks?
It's really hard to say. I think the timing is undeniable that in the week that student leaders of those protests were being rounded up, you had the government quietly drop the phrasing zero COVID. You had the government starting to talk about how there were no long-term complications that you get from COVID, how Omicron actually has quite a low viral load. At the same time, as early as November, the government in Beijing at least had already started talking about these optimization measures to prevent some of the most ridiculous examples of what I've just described of zero COVID. So I think Beijing had always wanted to go on this trajectory, but I would be surprised if the protests had no role at all to play in how speedily all of this has happened over the last week or so.
And Chinese leaders have been touting China's zero COVID strategy as a big positive point of difference in terms of their messaging with the West. They're saying, we are doing COVID right. Look at what's happened to the West, and they're sort of drawing a link there. Do you think the Chinese state will still be trying to push that narrative, and will that undermine their messaging in this regard, do you think?
I think they will still be trying to differentiate themselves to the West. You hear that quite a lot, that the Chinese care about lives, the West doesn't because it's more individualistic, or that kind of thing. I would be surprised if this was a proper opening up of the sort that we would be expecting here in the UK, or that we have seen. It's not going to be like that. I think it's just going to be kind of lowering the restrictions of zero COVID. But I think lockdown will still be a measure that the government will be using, if only to just stem the speed of infection increases. Because if Omicron hits China the way that it hit the US or the UK when it first came around, we'd be looking at hundreds of thousands of deaths in China. And I don't think the government would let that happen. So I think they will still be going steadily, carefully on this one. And in doing so, they'll be saying, look at us, we're not letting it rip, as it were, in the same way that the West has done. So I think they will still be trying to get some political brownie points from this.
Yes, because you've preempted my next question, which was, has there been any acknowledgement from the Chinese government that they may have got this wrong? Has there been a mea culpa, or is it how are they selling this policy to a domestic audience?
Not at all, Patrick. I think you would be surprised to hear.
I'm shocked.
What's happened is that the sudden discovery of new evidence, in quote marks, has actually helped them come down a little bit. So by saying that Chinese scientists have discovered that there are no long-term complications from COVID as they had initially feared, or that the Omicron variant is low in viral load. I mean, you could argue that these were things that we knew a year ago or even before, but the Chinese, by saying that this is new evidence that Chinese scientists have found, they are able to kind of open up a bit more. So there's no mea culpa on that front. And I don't think we will be expecting anything like that at all. But I think on the ground, some Chinese people are a bit confused, because they're asking, well, you told us this was really scary, and the rest of the world was in COVID hell. Well, what's going on now?
And just before I let you go, Cindy, do you think this will quell the protests, or has that story got some legs yet?
I think it will. I think it will. I mean, bearing in mind that the protests really only happened over the space of a weekend, that is across the China in multiple cities at the same time, protesting against the same thing. Really, as soon as Monday of that week, the heavy police presence and targeting of student ringleaders, sending some of these university students home to their parents early, it has really kind of dissipated the protests. The frustration, the background frustration of the whole population is still there. And if the restrictions don't go, if the government wasn't taking these kind of measures, rhetorical and actual measures, then I think they would flare up very quickly as well. But also, I just want to say, Patrick, on the other hand, if they let the virus rip and there are hundreds of thousands of deaths, you can see exactly the same kind of people who will also not be happy with that, very
Mm.
justifiably. It is a very tricky situation for the government to be in. With benefit of hindsight, they really should have ramped up vaccination when they had the time. They really should have ramped up ICU capacity when they had the time. But now it's just looking quite. It is going to be a scary moment, I think, over the next year or so. It's not going to be easy.